Hello all, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/16 scale radio controlled Israeli M51 Super Sherman. The model that you see here was built for commission and belongs to a private collector. Like I mentioned in many of my other build videos, I often take on commission build projects ranging from 1/35 scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. As for pricing and availability information, that information can be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Before I continue with the video, let's have a quick walk around of the model. The model that you see here started off as a Tamiya radio-controlled M51 kit. The kit itself was pre-assembled by another model maker who built the vehicle pretty much out of the box, but did do a very adequate job in hooking up all of the tank's radio-controlled features and functions. The exterior of the model was pretty much built out of the box. However, the model did feature several aftermarket additions, which we will be going over in this video. Unlike my other 1/16 scale builds that you see on my video listings, this vehicle here required an extensive amount of work in converting the tank from the welded hull M4 Sherman that is stocked with Tamiya kit to the casted hull M4A1 Sherman that we have here. Of all of Tamiya's 1/16 scale tank releases, their M51 Super Sherman left a lot to be desired. Tamiya really took a shortcut in the release of this kit by leaving the upper body as well as the lower chassis completely stock and carried over from their 105 Sherman release. Pretty much the only new additions that Tamiya released for the M51 was the M51 turret, as well as a few small little accessories that are to be glued to the side of the hull. Here we have the original upper hull that was swapped out for this kit. Now, the upper hull itself is accurate to make an M51. However, what was not found on any of the Israeli M51s was that of the original engine deck for the original tank's radial engine. When the Shermans were modified by the Israelis to M51 specs, the original engines were removed in favor of new diesel engines were put in place. As for the vehicle that you see here, this vehicle is built for the 1967 Six-Day War and features a replacement engine deck that is true to that time period. One of the challenges of this build was the requirement of the customer to replace the welded hull with that of a M4A1 cast upper. Even though the Israelis did use several welded hulled Shermans for their M51 conversion, the majority of the M51s that the Israelis used were that of modified M4A1E8s. In order to facilitate the conversion, the customer supplied with the model an upper hull and transmission cover from Nick Aguilar. The Nick Aguilar aftermarket upper hull is a very nicely detailed component. It features the correct shape, as well as all of its finely detailed cast texturing, Chrysler Super G, tarpaulin rail, and other finely detailed components. In addition to replacing the upper hull, the front transmission cover that you see on this model is also a replacement set from Nick Aguilar. The transmission itself, the cover is also finely detailed with all of the cast texturing, toe eyes, as well as the little footman loops that we have that are standard on later style Sherman transmission covers. The Aguilar transmission cover swaps out the Tamiya unit and mounts on in the same manner, and also very securely and very effortlessly. The only modification that I made to the transmission cover was that of the bolt strip. The original unit had a finely detailed bolt strip molded into the casting. However, when it became time to mount it to the hull, I personally found that because of the bolt strap, it was very hard to secure the two lock holes, the two lock fasteners that are found on the top portion of the transmission cover. So rather than trying to fill it with a small screwdriver trying to get in there, I went ahead and simply replaced the bolt strip that was molded in with that from the original Tamiya kit. The original one was sanded flush. The unit was then bolted to the tank as you would on the original Tamiya, and then the plastic unit was simply mounted to the transmission cover. Then the bolt cover, the strip itself, was thoroughly blended into the transmission cover with that of bodywork to create a nice seamless appearance that we have here. As for the upper deck, to mount it to the lower hull, did require some modifications made to the lower hull pan. As we recall, on these Tamiya Shermans, the lower hull is comprised of a pressed panel of aluminum. Because of the geometry of the M4A1 hull, the lower sponsons needed to have been trimmed. The place they get trimmed is in the back here to accommodate the rounded rear portion of the vehicle, and also on the front portion. Due to the M4A1's boat-like appearance, the sponsons are much shorter and rounded than that of the standard welded M4A3 or standard welded hull that's found on the stock Tamiya kit. To secure the upper hull to the chassis, that is facilitated with the two large snaps that are found on the original Tamiya kit, but also for added support, 4 very powerful magnets were added to the top upper hull. There's a magnet on each corner of the upper deck, and epoxy to the aluminum pan are steel plates. With the addition of the 4 magnets, it really helps in keeping the unit nice and sturdy, and you're not going to have to worry about the tank wobbling or the upper deck popping off on you when the model is in operation. However, to remove the upper hull, you simply give a nice little tug, and the whole upper deck is removable. In addition to the upper deck being removable, the power switch, which is located on the inside of the vehicle, also has a disconnect jack so that the upper body can be fully removed from the lower chassis if maintenance needs to occur. Like I mentioned, to build this model, I actually had to convert the vehicle 2 times. Once the M4A1 E8 conversion was completed, it was then time to do what the Israelis did and convert it to an M51. First area that was converted and was focused on was the rear lower hull. As you can see, the M51 was a lot different compared to that of the standard Sherman. Over here we have the goosenecking exhaust. There's only one exhaust on this vehicle as opposed to the 2 goosenecking exhausts which are found on the A3, or for the top mounted dual exhausts which are found on the original radial engine. In addition to the exhaust, we also have here a double door access hatch, which is similar to the A3 and other variants of the Sherman, but on the Israeli tanks they protrude from the lower hull and, if we notice, are off-centered. Now, these details that we see here are a resin upgrade set from Shumo. The set gives you the engine hatch, the lifting eye, the toe eyes that we have in the back, as well as a plastic replacement rear wall and angle plate which conceals and covers up all of the original Tamiya holes which are found on the stock plate. The set also can be built in two ways. You can have it with the goosenecking exhaust, or you can have it with the bolted up plate, in which the goosenecking exhaust was replaced with a top deck exhaust pipe, which came later on towards the late 1970s and early 1980s. Also, the goosenecking exhaust is the M51 variant, in that the Israelis modified the stock exhaust by welding a box and a chunk to the left-hand portion here of the exhaust neck. One portion, though, that was scratch built was this lower portion here of the rear wall. The standard M4A1 cuts straight across from left to right, and when the Israelis modified them, they went ahead and copied the design similar to that of the M4A3, in which the rear hull descends downward. This downward descent here had to have been fabricated. This unit here was all fabricated out of Lexan plastic and was then mounted permanently to the upper hull and has its weld beads to illustrate that. Now, the box that we see here is not connected to the lower hull and is permanently attached to the upper hull. To take off the upper deck, you need to slide the upper hull backward and downward in order to unlock it from this section here in order to pick it up. This had to have been done, otherwise it would be a seam over here, which would have been very noticeable. In addition to fabricating the box, we also have two little foot loops welded to each side of the unit. And also underneath the model, we could see here the grill work that was also fabricated. These grill fins are all scratch built out of styrene and mimic that of the real M51 Super Sherman. Moving our way up, we also go into more M51 details. Starting with the rear rack. The rear rack that you see here is the standard rack that's found on the Tamiya kit, and the rack itself is the standard rack which is used on USAFV. The only difference was that when the Israelis modified their tanks, the first batch of M51s featured the same rack, only instead of the rack being double hinged, it was permanently welded to the rear plate. The rack was able to fold up, as the folds as well as the hinges were retained, only were now permanently welded to the rear plate. The unit here, like I mentioned, is a stock Tamiya one. The only additions that were added were the additions of the gun cleaning rod or gun cleaning stave mounts, which are fabricated into the tank. Also on the back, we have here the telephone box. Telephone box is the resting one from SKP. It's a nice unit and was mounted as is. To mount it, I went ahead and fabricated a small little plate out of steel, which formed a bracket and elevates the box from the rear deck. Over here we have the M51 travel lock. M51 featured a very specific travel lock that is signature for this series of tank. The travel lock that we see here is the resin version from SKP. Again, very nicely, intricately casted, and is designed to be fully functional. It pivots and also locks as well as unlocks. The unit that we have here, when it arrived to my shop, was in a little bit of a wrecked condition and was fully restored and returned back to operational condition that we have here. Molded into the SKP unit, as of note, are 4 little rubber pads, which are used to prevent marring of the barrel. These pieces are found on the real unit, and on the model, it's also a nice tip to paint them black, if not add a little bit of weathering to them while you're at it. Moving on to the rear engine deck, this is probably the most significant change of the entire hull. The rear engine deck that we have here is a new set from EastCoastArmory.com. It's casted in resin, and this set here is a drop-in modification for the Tamiya M51. Not only can it be installed to the Nick Aguilar upper hull that I have here, but can also be used to correct the Tamiya rear deck. As I mentioned earlier, the Tamiya rear deck is inaccurate for an M51. The rear deck contains the deck as well as the two engine hatches, as well as the new fuel filler cover caps that we have here. Now this engine deck, as of note, is that of the Batch 1, which would be common for that of tanks from the late 1960s. Moving along, we have here the Tank's Pioneer tools. Tank's Pioneer tools are the basic versions from Tamiya, with the exception of the crowbar. Crowbar itself is scratch built by me. As we notice, the tool posts themselves, as well as the lifting rings, are painted in red. This is as per several real Israeli vehicles that I've seen. The tank side details are as follows. All these M51s feature jerry cans in these three locations here, as well as on the tail. It's a mirror image on the opposite side. The jerry cans that we see on this model are a new set from EastCoastArmory.com. They are resin and are designed to be that of the early style Israeli tanks, which utilize recycled U.S. jerry cans from World War II. The jerry cans themselves are painted the same color of the vehicle, as per my resources. Also, the first batch of Israeli M51s featured spare track racks on either side of the vehicle in this location here. Later on, the Israeli Shermans were modified to have two of these large storage bins on the sides. The storage bin itself is that from SKP. It's also a nice resin piece and is very nicely detailed and highly recommended if you're building an M51. Moving our way to the model's sheet metal work. Like I mentioned, the tanks started off as M4A1E8s, which means they utilize the extended fenders for the HVSS suspension. The fenders that we have on this vehicle are all scratch built out of sheet metal and are done with the exact same techniques and details that I incorporate in my 1/6 scale M4 Sherman builds. The panels themselves are all pressed. Their fender mounts are all drilled in and are fastened to the tank via micro fasteners. The fender supports are the Shumo ones, and they are made in metal and are a very nice addition. Where the mounts meet to the vehicle, there are small little bosses which elevate them from being mounted flush to the tank, also just like on the real Shermans. The fenders themselves are actually three separate pieces, two shorter ones in the front and a longer one in the center. Again, also like the real vehicles, and underneath, the pieces are all soldered together, giving for a nice, strong unit, which will hold up to the wears of radio control. As for the front, the M4A1 featured a unique geometry for the front fender. Because of the front corner tips, the M4A1 for mounting on the front fenders had a small little plate welded to the front with a support rib. This small little component here actually was also fabricated out of sheet metal, and when the M4A1s got their E8 upgrade, the side little section here was bolted to the plate, and then the wider fender was then fastened to the whole unit. This detailing was incorporated in the 116 model that we have here. As for the front fenders, just like on my 1/6 scale counterparts, they are all made out of sheet metal. The rigidity ribs are pressed into the sheet metal. They feature their fasteners as well as their fender mounts. The fender mounts are also, again, sheet metal and soldered directly to the unit, thus having for a very realistic and strong bond. The sheet metal tin work is a mirror image on the opposite side. The only difference between the left and right side detailing is that on the M51, on the driver's hand side, the auxiliary generator exhaust was moved from exiting from the rear of the vehicle, from emerging from the top deck. It emerges from the upper hull and is shielded in a small little heat shield. The heat shield itself is fabricated out of sheet metal and is also all soldered together, as well as the exhaust pipe on the inside That is all fabricated out of resin as well as aluminum.